Welcome to a new theme. We are going to talk about storytelling in architecture and visions and strategies defined by the municipality of Copenhagen under the lead of the city architect. And this architecture policy that we are going to dive into now was taken into use for around 5 years ago, and is the plan, the vision, the strategy that will be followed up until 2025. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that from now on. And I'm starting out with this image, which was taken on the City Hall Square last summer, where there was this guy from Barcelona, I think he is from, playing with soap bubbles on the City Hall Square. You can meet him all over Europe, actually. I've also seen him somewhere else. I've seen him in Barcelona and in Rome and in Austria also. But the thing is that the reason why I put this picture on is there are two reasons. One of them is to show you that this is what it looks like when there is not a corona crisis going on. Then the city is full of life, full of people, full of people enjoying each other. And that's the overall purpose with the architecture policy and the strategy for how to develop Copenhagen. That is about to create a city where people would want to live and be in. Another reason for me to share with you this picture is that it is placed in the middle of Copenhagen in a very, you could say, unique area with a lot of different stories going on. And one of these narratives that we're going to dive into is exactly the rounded building in the background, which is one of the very characteristic new buildings that is branding Copenhagen very much in regards to the city of architecture and design that Copenhagen wants to look at itself as. So let's begin and talk a little bit about what storytelling in architecture is about in a Copenhagen sense. This is the view of Copenhagen. I've talked a little bit about this before, and now I'm going to point out the characteristics of it. What you see here is a city which is quite flat. And you see a lot of towers and spires. And whenever there is a tall building, it does have a characteristic profile to it. That is very, very unique for Copenhagen. It's not that it doesn't exist anywhere else. It does. You can see similar phenomena in Stockholm, for instance. But it's different from Berlin and London and Paris, simply from the fact that there are not very many high-rises, if any. So the Copenhagen identity is very much connected to the fact that most buildings are rarely higher than 5, 6, 7 stories high. Sorry. And if they are higher, then it's typically a spire or a tower or something else that draws your attention. So that uniqueness, that theme that focuses on building on Copenhagen uniqueness and our common cultural heritage, that is something that this idea about storytelling for Copenhagen is about. So storytelling storytelling in Copenhagen is about creating new architecture based on distinctive character of Copenhagen as such. It's about building on local characters to reinforce diversity and unique neighborhoods. And it's about respecting cultural historical values in the built environment and local area. These are the three headlines that we will dive down into in 2.1, 2.2, and 2.3. The two next sessions about local character and cultural historical value will go a little bit further in depth with some very characteristic neighborhoods that has been converted and is being developed to new urban districts right now. But today we're going to talk about the storytelling in architecture, about creating new architecture based on the distinctive character of Copenhagen. Because Copenhagen must continue to appear as a well-preserved city, which through new conditions and increased urban nature adds new layers and stories to the distinctiveness of the city by interpreting and transforming the existing city into new ways. Copenhagen's main feature must therefore be maintained and strengthened as a foundation for the city's development. Condensation and climate adaptation are issues and tools and strategies within this, because we need to deal with the fact that we have been talking about quite a few times already, that the rising population growth and extensive climate adaptation in the city means that the city must embrace completely new needs, both new urban spaces and buildings, new urban areas, and renewal of existing ones must complement the city. It makes demands on this design and the scope and location of all future development and renovation. So new larger buildings and high-rise buildings that breaks with the city's overall scale, profile, and landscape features, that require special attention and care. It's important that they bring the city and the concrete placement architectural added value, also in a close human scale. You can't just do anything. The city architect and the municipality as such has an ambition about being able to control all new developments so that they are in line with the historic context and the history of the city, so that it builds upon what is already there and it does not like extrapolate in totally weird and different directions. So something must be guidelines in order to make few architects and engineers understand what they have to deal with when building new. This image is on the top of the Mask Tower. The Mask Tower is the case of this lecture. And afterwards, I'm gonna show you around in the neighborhood of the Mask Tower and show you what the Mask Tower actually is, in order to tell you the story about that you actually can go into the Mask Tower and up to the top floor, which is public, and from there have this magnificent view of Copenhagen, which you actually see in the distance here in the horizon, where you really have the ultimate experience of the city of towers and spires that is so characteristic for Copenhagen. And that's why I chose to bring this picture in this very space. This is another very prominent project. I'm also going to show you more about the context for this building. It is designed by a very, very talented architecture office that is called Lundberg Tranberg, and it's the Royal Playhouse. The thing about the Royal Playhouse is that it is built in a very sensitive area. So when Copenhagen wants to create new architecture based on the distinctive character of Copenhagen, Copenhagen will do this by designing and transforming buildings with the respect of the retention of essential architectural values, both in the urban environment and in the individual building, so that new buildings, additions, and changes represent contemporary interpretation of existing architectural qualities. Then you can ask yourself, what is the characteristic in this sense? This building consist when you design a theater like this one, which is quite a prominent theater also because it's a national urban royal theater, then you have to create a building that can accommodate complex and high prestigious shows and plays. And that requires, for instance, that you have a very tall stage tower. And a stage tower in this sense is a really large construction to place in a very sensitive neighborhood. What Lundberg Tranberg chose to do in this case was actually saying that, well, you can't avoid having this tall stage house, but you have to give it some kind of character that adds to the area rather than dominates the area. So they have withdrawn it from the facade and they have cladded it with some really, really beautiful tiles. And tiles is a very traditional material in the Danish context. We have a lot of clay in the underground, so we have a long tradition for actually building with tiles in Denmark. And this playhouse kind of take up that tradition and praise it in a sense in order to give this stage tower character at the same time as they don't want it to dominate the surroundings. Another interesting issue is that this is also a tall construction, but they kind of broke it down in the facade construction, and this height is never ever taller than surrounding buildings. So in that sense, they also kind of work with breaking down this huge construction into elements that speaks together with the surroundings without dominating the surroundings. And they actually managed to do this in a very successful way. And the Playhouse is extremely popular. Also, not only for plays, but also for getting together. It has a good restaurant and good cafe. And in the summer times, they have outdoor shows and plays in this area. And it's really very, very popular. So in this sense, what you need to stress in a situation like this is that you want the vision of a new huge construction like this one to be something that enhance Copenhagen as a city of unique neighborhoods with a cohesive context. The architectural cohesion is strengthened by understanding and building on the cultural history that is the foundation of Copenhagen, and by always considering landscape and building together. Never ever see them apart, see them together. The unique neighborhoods and locations can be enhanced by considering the local conditions that have their own stories to tell, like in this case, the heights and the materials, and the way, the openness towards the surroundings, this transparency that allows people to go along this building and sense that there is something festive and nice and culturally high level things going on inside this building. So we should continually supplement, transform, and add new architecture which interprets and renews what is already there, both in regard to the wider context and in dealing with a specific location, like in this case. Architecture should tell a story, and Copenhagen is a city that is known for the design at every level. This is really high profile architecture at a very high design level. And it goes for all from planning to buildings and from public spaces to streets, furniture and equipment. And this architecture story that we see here is a concern with distinct architectural quality. Architectural character comes from the site-specific features in the history of the city that has created and continues to create. It is linked in different ways to the city as a whole, a district, a neighborhood, a specific place. This is what makes Copenhagen architecture so unique and defines the architectural core character of the city and its individual neighborhoods. Another example of that is much smaller scale. This is a building which is built in the pedestrian street Strøget, one of the first pedestrian streets in Copenhagen. And it's built in a very sensitive site. We have two listed buildings here, and we had an empty site for several years. This was empty for like 25 years because nobody could really figure out how to develop this site and how to build something of architectural identity of its own between two such nice and delicate facades as the ones that are next to. Every architecture office in Copenhagen, more or less, have tried to solve this issue, but it has been really difficult, and it didn't succeed for several years until this young architecture firm of Seto Architects came into play and worked together with the client, which was a law firm, to define an architecture that actually added to the neighborhood much more than withdraw from the neighborhood. So another answer to the question about how Copenhagen will create new architecture based on its distinctive character of Copenhagen, then you could say in this case that Copenhagen will do this by using Copenhagen's defining characters and existing architectural values as a basis for the contemporary architecture. The building is less than 5 years old, and it is a new property alongside the renovation of these two properties. They were renovated also in this process, and it tells us a story about how the city developed from a fortified city into a modern metropolis, and how the city's architecture has shaped the ambitions, concerns, and aesthetic ideals of every era. Once we have built and added new layers to the city, we continually convert the city's buildings and spaces to match new function and uses with respect for their history. Today, Copenhagen thus remains largely well preserved and recognizable, with great diversity among the individual districts and neighborhoods. This building, I have some descriptions of it here, and it tells a little bit about that this building is used for business, and it has been built with climate screens of brick wall and deck structures of wooden beams. And the new building is built in concrete elements and supplemented with in situ molded adaptations. And a general energy optimization has been installed in the facade with facade insulation, low energy windows, and energy efficient ventilation systems. What you cannot see here is that it has a green roof with sedum coating and acts as a rainwater collection, rainwater retardant up here. Quite successful contemporary take on how to add on and fill in between sensitive architecture in listed buildings right next to this building site. This is not very far away, and that is actually the same complex that I showed you in the first picture. It is something called Axel Towers, and again we have Lundgaard Tranberg Architects as the designers on this quite successful complex here. And again, we could say that in an attempt to answering the question about how Copenhagen will create new architecture based on this distinctive character of Copenhagen, in this sense, Copenhagen will do it by designing and placing high-rise, and large corporate buildings or residential developments in a way that matches the character of the city and the particular area, taking into account the existing topography, profile, density, scale, way of use, and sightlines. The area is quite interesting here because we are in the middle of an area with a lot of amusement activities going on. The building complex is right across from the Tivoli Garden, and we have a lot of cafes and restaurants, cinemas, show places, a building for circus, and a building for big dinner shows, and a very, you could say, vivid and lively area. And in that sense, this site was also demanding because there had been some very vivid earlier buildings upon here with a lot of amusement things going on in them. So everybody in Denmark is more or less aware of the fact that funny things, interesting things, lively things, shows, and whatever is going on in this area. And the building, in a sense, should kind of mirror that. And that made the architects do a very brave choice of actually working with these silos and combining them in some patterns that create some really interesting feelings about this area and gives it new identity and new branding value. It is 5 towers, there are 15 floors. Some of the top floors are dedicated to law firms, but in the ground floor and first floor, you have a lot of cafes and restaurants and other inviting public things going on there that kind of leaves and develops and under supports some activity and amusement and nice behavior and make people have fun. So in that sense, it's a very engaging building, and the architects succeeded in creating a building which at the same time also mirrors that and creates a good sense and a good atmosphere for people using this. And you can say that some of the ideas that has been unique and has been distinctive to this is about strengthening and understanding the cultural history that is the foundation of Copenhagen, and by always considering the landscape and the building together also in this case. Same architects, Lundgaard Tranberg, has also built this beautiful building complex for SEB Bank. This complex is very close to the harbor, and it is in an area which used to be a train and freight port and train and freight yard area with a very rough atmosphere, if you could say so, very industrial, heavy, noisy, rough neighborhood, which is now being transformed into a much more, you could say, inviting neighborhood, a very international feel to it. There's a lot of hotels in these areas, and also, like in this case, a foreign bank, a Swedish bank, Svenska Enskilda Banken, is the name of the bank that has its Danish headquarters in this area. In order to actually also invite and be friendly towards guests, the emphasis has been put on this area between the buildings. And that area is actually the first climate adaptation project in Copenhagen, where it is focused upon collecting rainwater to be reused for irrigation and for cooling on hot summer days. So this entire artificial landscape that SLA architects did between these buildings is a way to actually also create a nice stroll, a nice walk for people moving around in this area, for people living in the hotels, and for people going back and forth between the offices and the the international companies that live in that live and have their headquarters in this area. So it's also like a, you could say, an area that requires some specific consideration on how to fit into this area and at the same time create something that is attractive and has a good brand quality and actually gives something back to the people using these complex building here. So in this sense, to answer the question about how Copenhagen will create new architecture based on the distinctive character of Copenhagen, in this sense and this place, Copenhagen does it by generally designing and placing high-rises as slender tower buildings that serve as landmarks that support wayfinding in the city, which is a theme for this 2.1 class, and the theme also for the Maersk Tower that I'm going to go a little bit further in depth with in the tour that will come in another lecture. So an example of how to go abroad or above, I mean, the 5-6 story high buildings and creates buildings that are landmarks and that attract attention and tell stories and can act as wayfinding in the city. SEB Bank is in this sense also a building that underlines this principal idea. And where you can really find many of these buildings that underline this idea is in the eastern coast of Amager, where you used to have a heavy industrial area with a lot of port activity and freight activity, and not at all attractive or nice or a way you would want to go to enjoy yourself in. Since 2000 or more or less, this area has been developed with many new housing units. And since you were very close to the coast and you were very close to a very big open area, and you would want to also make it attractive for people who would want to go there, then the high rises play a big role in the planning of these of the coast area out here. So these high rises that you see here, they contain housing, quite expensive housing. And there are quite a few of them. It's probably the place in Copenhagen where you will see most high rises at all. And in this case, it's very much about creating an attractive urban city. Part of the city, it is sorry, it's along a 2 kilometers long coast artificial island that has been built out here. This is artificial island because the original coastline is here, and that means that you actually have this lagoon, which makes a gentle, nice, soft, if you could say so, area in here where you can swim, or you can kite surf, or you can kayak, or you can fish, or you can do a lot of recreational things in here. And then you have the actual beach out here, and also out there you can have a lot of recreational things going on: swimming, surfing, kayaking, sailing, whatever. So establishing this artificial beach out here has created a very much attractive feel to the overall area. And this was actually established long before you began to develop this area, because you wanted to kind of create this sense of a nice neighborhood and a beautiful setting to make it attractive for people to want to come out there and live in this area. And that's where the development of this area began and resulted in a lot of high rises, which is significantly interesting at this point because you have this extraordinary view of the sound and of the rest of Copenhagen around here. So you're really up in large scale, and it's much different than the old part of the city, which is much more dense. So high rises are very welcome in that part of the city. And in order to, again, to answer the question about how Copenhagen will create new architecture based on the distinctive character of Copenhagen, in this sense, you can say that they will do, Copenhagen will do this by using architecture competitions or parallel commissions in connection with high-rise projects and defining conditions for the architectural expression of high-rise buildings and the facades in detail that allow for high-rise developments, especially in an area like this. We have been around this area already because that's the Enghave Park project that I showed you in the lecture 1.3, I think it was. The renovation of this park area in a very close and dense neighborhood of Vesterbro, where you have a very unique take on climate adaptation, since we have this big reservoir of water down below where you collect rainwater from the entire neighborhood and store it and use it for irrigation and other issues, or for recreational purposes in terms of filling up this basin, for instance. And that is also like connecting to an existing story of a neighborhood, and at the same time allowing for this to also mirror that we are living in the 21st century, and we are both loyal to culture and history, but we are also looking into the future. And to answer the question again about creating new architecture based on distinctive character and of Copenhagen, then in this case it is a mission about doing this by making Copenhagen greener with more and better green spaces in order to enhance the character of the city and ensure that climate change adaptation is an integral part of the architectural solution. And in this case, we're not talking about building, we're talking about a park space. We're continuing the park typology, but it's not really the park as such. It is a sensation, the atmosphere that I would want to stress here. And then it is these benches that you see here. Because these benches are typically Copenhagen benches. They are actually called Copenhagen benches. And it's like 90% of benches in the Copenhagen area are Copenhagen benches. So it's also a way that Copenhagen actually want to create some kind of cohesion, a cohesive way of understanding that you are in Copenhagen, and Copenhagen builds on history, but it also looks into the future. And you do that in this case by saying that this is a design that has been working over times. Why should we want to change that when it works and it's actually beautiful at the same time? So what has been done here is that you continue producing the Copenhagen bench and you continue using it as a historical thread back and forth in time, and a cohesive thread also to be experienced several places in Copenhagen to tell you that you are in a Copenhagen context. So Copenhagen will in this case create new architecture and new planning based on the distinctive character of Copenhagen by maintaining and developing the universal Copenhagen identity in urban furnishing and exteriors to preserve a sense of recognition and coherence in the public spaces designed for free movement, while consciously developing and supporting local identities in city squares and parks. And with this slide, I'm going to jump to the last side of this lecture, which is about the fact that Copenhagen is also, especially in the wintertime, a dark city. One of the characteristics about Copenhagen, which you will experience, you have already been here, and you who will eventually come here, is that you don't experience very many buildings that are lit in the nighttime. But you experience very much like what you see over here, that you can see what's going on inside the buildings. So it's a way to kind of frame life. It's not about framing the buildings, it's about framing the life that goes on in the buildings. In this case, it's the Royal Library that has probably things going on, lectures, shows, music performances or whatever. And this big open facade here invites you to come in, or it is like a transparent skin between outdoor and indoor that tells you that something is going on in there. So that is a typical feature of Copenhagen, that you have this framing of what's going on inside the building rather than lighting the building. And you also have a framing of that it's safe to go around in the city. So whenever there is, like in this case, a bridge, a pedestrian bridge that allows you to go from one coast or one front to another harbor front in the city. That's another characteristic about Copenhagen, that is that there is so much water and there are so many bridges you have to cross to get over the water. So in this case, Olafur Eliasson, who is an Icelandic Danish artist, world famous, he actually designed this bridge as a metaphor of ships, sail ships, sailing boats. And he did that to also make like a entertaining, inviting, amusing, interactive way of walking around in the city. And when you do that, you would want to lit it in the dark nighttime, so that people passing by or crossing this bridge feel safe and secure. So in that sense, since we have these long nights in the wintertime, very much about the artificial lighting of Copenhagen is about inviting people in, framing what's going on in buildings, making people feel safe and secure while wandering around in the city. So that is also like the last thing that you could talk about when you would want to say something about how Copenhagen create new architecture based on the distinctive character of Copenhagen. Then it can be very much about that Copenhagen will do this by aiming at architectural consistency, by creating a combination of general and effect lighting that brings out the character of the city and the unique local areas, public spaces, buildings and context, and allow people to experience the night sky, the changing seasons, and the Nordic light and the darkness. That would be all for now. Thank you.